I remember the exact moment I decided he was dead to me. I just closed my 15th back-to-back week of 60-plus hour sprints, migrating legacy code to the microservices architecture I'd designed, debugging the new load balancer, training junior devs on Kubernetes. At 8:47 p.m., exhausted and wired, I ferried a half-empty coffee cup back to my cubicle, only to overhear the exchange that finished me off. "Hey Marco," said Rena, our product lead, leaning against the frame of Director Whitman's office. "I've wrapped up the analytics tool. Ready to demo next week." He looked up from his red-lined budget report. "Great work, but we don't have the dollars for a promotion, maybe next quarter." He flicked his gaze at my empty seat and tapped his desk. "Carry on," Rena forced a smile. "Understood." She squeezed my shoulder and walked away. I stood frozen, coffee sloshing in the styrofoam cup. Promotion, raise, equity, whatever hadn't mattered. Whitman, our director of operations, had shut down every plea for better pay or title for years. Maybe next quarter was his toxic mantra. He rewarded loyalty with crumbs. I was done. That night, I lay awake in my one-bedroom apartment, ceiling fan churning single pale blade shadows across the walls. I thought, I've poured my career into this place. I wrote the most efficient data ingestion pipeline in the company. I architected the real-time monitoring dashboard that cut outages by 70%. They'd replaced on-call rotations with my automated alert system, my baby. And Whitman never even knew how much risk he'd averted. He didn't care. So I made a decision: if he wouldn't recognize my worth, I'd demonstrate it elsewhere, and quietly dismantle his empire from the inside out. Within 48 hours, I drafted the patent application for my pipeline optimization tool. It wasn't just another script. It was a self-learning feedback loop that adjusted resource allocation on the fly, minimizing costs and maximizing throughput. Built on open-source foundations. Yes, but my code introduced a novel graph-based algorithm that predicted workload spikes with 90% accuracy. The kind of thing a PhD might publish. It was brilliant, uncommonly so. But it was sitting in Git repos and internal Kubernetes clusters, unmonetized, unpatented. I filed the application that night, e-filing under my own name, marking it as a process improvement system for distributed data ingestion. It cost me $2,000 in filing fees and late Saturday coffee runs, but that was nothing compared to the windfall I was planning. I didn't mention it to a soul, not to my fiancé, not to my mom, not to my best friend who'd made maybe $100 on her app. I let the patent office date stamp my ownership, rendering Whitman's domain legally off-limits unless he licensed it. Then I began seeding rumor. Over clattering keyboards and hum of Dell workstations, I mentioned in Slack channels, quietly, innocuously to people I trusted at partner companies. We should rebuild ingestion in the cloud-native stack, I'd say. Have you heard about the new Merino protocol, my cheeky code name? And then I'd wink in the client-facing chat. Soon, echoes of Merino protocol drifted through vendor forums. In LinkedIn posts, it gained traction. By the time Whitman next walked into the office, looking smug, I had offers. 3 big players in our space, 1 competitive SaaS vendor, 1 public cloud provider's consulting arm, and a stealth unicorn expressed interest. Their emails were glowing. "Is Merino protocol available as a standalone product? Could we license your innovation? We'd love a demo for our exec leadership." One even dangled a slot on their advisory board. I played coy. "I'll consider it," I'd replied, "but first I need to tie up some loose ends here." And I kept working on my improvements, baking in new features, predictive failure alerts, cost optimization dashboards, even as Whitman took credit for the uptick in reliability metrics at the weekly stand-up. Then came the first domino. A week before our quarterly developer conference, Whitman announced with smug certainty, "We're rolling out our new ingestion pipeline, version 3.1, complete with dynamic scaling capabilities." He gestured to his slide brimming with code snippets and what he dubbed Whitman's scalability stack. Clients nodded politely. Investors scribbled notes. Under the table, I cracked open my laptop and logged into our QA environment, where the internal build of version 3.1 was staging. I ran a quick query on the cluster metadata, C# copy edit select count, from usage_logs, where protocol equals sign Merino, 0. They hadn't licensed a single line of my patented code. They thought it was theirs. Instead, I had quietly replaced his scalability stack layer with an alias to my own microservice, deployed under a whimsical Docker tag, and no one noticed because the API endpoints were identical. So their 3.1 rollout wasn't Whitman's code at all. It was mine. That night, we had the first real load spike. Our US East server cluster got hammered by a social media-driven surge. The old stack would have slowed to a crawl, cost us thousands in over-provisioned nodes. But I watched in real time as my service spun up extra instances, redistributed partitions, and returned sub-200 ms response times. The monitoring graphs lit up green. Even the executives freaked out in delight on Slack. Another home run. Way to go, ops team. More importantly, Whitman's name was attached to the success. He basked in the glow. At the next executive town hall, he was lauded for innovative leadership. He strutted around with open arms, beaming. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in my cubicle, sipping coffee, watching his career thrive on the back of my patented tech. But here's the twist. I didn't mind that he took credit. In fact, I encouraged it. Because by publicly associating his leadership with this tool, this precise pipeline I'd patented, he was obligated to either A, disclose its provenance, B, refuse to use it, or C, license it from me. He couldn't claim ownership without violating patent law, and once a competitor got wind, we'd have legal leverage. Sure enough, it happened. A month later, I got a call from a general counsel at CloudWorks, a cloud-native consultancy who'd been spinning up our pipeline on AWS. "We saw your patent pop up on our dashboards," the lawyer said, voice measured. "It appears your technology is running in production in several Fortune 500 accounts, including ours. We'd like to obtain a commercial license." I smiled. Of course. Let's discuss terms. He rattled off numbers: license for production, royalties per node, indemnity clauses. By the end of the call, CloudWorks agreed to a 6-figure annual fee, retroactive to the day they first tested my protocol. I forwarded the signed agreement to our CFO, who nearly choked. In the hallways, Whitman looked uneasy. He'd noticed the legal letters arriving in the mail, in his name, and the finance team fielding billing notices. The CFO cornered him. "We can't pay these fees. We didn't budget for a licensing cost for your scalability stack." Whitman sputtered, "These are our core systems." The CFO glared. "Apparently they're Marco Marino's systems now. We need a game plan." And that's how I quietly dismantled his career. Within 2 quarters, the costs piled up: CloudWorks license, competitor licenses from an AI startup that also adopted my protocol, even a public sector contract in Europe, triggered royalties. He tried to refactor the code, but his team only re-rolled back to my Docker images because no one else could match the performance. Each rollback triggered new patent alerts, new legal letters, new boardroom headaches. By the time I walked into the annual off-site retreat 4 months later, Whitman's job was on the line. Investors were furious. How could our shining growth strategy hinge on unlicensed tech? Executives demanded accountability. He clung to the podium like a rusted ship's mast, blaming miscommunication and operational lag. But the board had heard enough. They handed him his walking papers over lunch, under the soft glow of chandeliers. I was promoted in the same breath: Marco Marino, VP of Innovation, patent holder, guarantor of scalability. I signed off on the board minutes before Whitman's resignation was public. He left with a half-hearted farewell party. I was busy prepping the speech for next month's Tech Expo, where I'd launch the open-source edition of Marino Protocol under a permissive license, ensuring he couldn't ever weaponize it against me again. So here's where I leave you in part 1. On the morning Whitman got the news, I stood at the lobby elevator, keys in my pocket and coffee in hand, watching him sign his exit paperwork. The doors closed between us. I turned and walked up to my office. My inbox pinged 2 more licensing requests, one from a global bank, one from a biotech firm. My patent firm emailed a reminder: next maintenance fee due. I smiled. My career and my raise were secure, won not by begging but by planning. Because sometimes, when the director denies you your due, the best revenge is to claim what's rightfully yours, quietly, legally, and irreversibly. And sometimes dismantling a career doesn't require shouting. It just needs a stroke of a pen and a well-timed patent application. Tomorrow, I'll stand on stage at Tech Expo and reveal the open-source version, give it away for free, invite the world to build on it. Whitman's old empire will crumble further as my community embraces the protocol that once made him a hero and then unmade him entirely. I still remember the hush that fell over the lobby when Whitman stepped off the elevator for the last time, heralded not by applause but by a cluster of HR reps waiting with forms. He paused, looked around at familiar faces, some sympathetic, others steely, and then strode past without a backward glance. I watched until the doors closed, and then pivoted on my heel. Today was my day. That morning, I arrived at my office, suit jacket in hand, coffee in the other, and stopped in front of the whiteboard Whitman had once used to sketch growth paths. The board still bore his broad strokes: arrows to global expansion, notes to cloud transition, and a big red circle around Kubernetes Fusion. I grabbed an eraser and wiped it all away, leaving a clean slate. Below, I wrote in tight, confident script, Merino Protocol, Open Source Edition. It felt good to smudge out his ambitions and replace them with mine. Collaboration, transparency, community. By 9 a.m., my inbox was flooded. Marco, congrats. Now what? Can't wait to see the talk deck. Will the open source include the AI perf module? I skimmed the threads, my smile growing. I fired off a succinct announcement to the entire company. Team, as of today, we're open sourcing the Merino protocol under the Apache 2.0 license. Repositories and documentation are live at github.com/Merino protocol. Contributions welcome. Let's turn our proprietary edge into a global force. Cheers, Marco. Within minutes, GitHub stars climbed into the triple digits. My phone buzzed, ping from Hacker News, a thread about ex-Redstone engineer's generosity. Twitter lights flashed at Merino Protocol just became the hottest OSS project in cloud-native circles. By lunchtime, I slipped into the all-hands meeting, my first as VP of Innovation. The chief people officer introduced me with a spotlight that felt warmer than any I'd known. Everyone, please welcome Marco Merino, whose leadership and legal foresight have not only optimized our core systems, but propelled us into a new era of openness and growth. I took the stage, heart thrumming, and faced a sea of faces: developers, marketers, finance analysts, DevOps engineers, housekeeping staff, leaning back at the doors. I clicked to my first slide, a world map with pins spreading from New York to Bangalore. Thank you. Yesterday, we lost a director who was more enamored with spikes in his spreadsheet than the people who made those numbers possible. But today, we're writing a different story, one where our innovations power not just Redstone's bottom line, but the entire ecosystem. We're open sourcing Merino Protocol, so every startup, every enterprise, every researcher can build on it, and we'll support it, sponsor hackathons, seed grants for community contributions, and host an annual Merino Protocol Summit right here. Heads nodded, murmurs of excitement. I saw Derek in the back, fists pumping. Rena wiped tears of relief. They stood applauding. That afternoon, I hosted the first internal Merino Hack Day, where cross-functional teams, UX, data science, security teamed up to extend the protocol. Bright ideas bloomed: an adapter for edge devices, an ML-based anomaly detector plugin, a mobile-friendly dashboard. Laughter and collision of thought filled the lab. At 5:30 p.m., exhausted but exhilarated, I bumped into our new CEO, Joanna Reyes, brought in after Whitman's departure. We shook hands in the server room, humming with new deployments. Marco, she said, voice soft but firm, you've done something remarkable. We're already seeing 25% growth in GitHub contributions, 15% uptick in partner inquiries, and a flood of positive press. What's next? I tapped the terminal where logs scrolled. Phase 2 corporate partnerships. Bring Big Cloud and the open source community together. Then Phase 3, international developer academies, teaching Merino Prot at universities. Let's make this protocol a standard, like Kubernetes or TensorFlow. She beamed. I'm with you, all the way. Over the next quarter, Merino Protocol became a sensation. Conferences invited me to keynote. A Japanese consortium launched a localized version for IoT networks. Our own DevSec team baked in universal compliance modules, extending the tool's reach to healthcare and finance. Redstone's stock ticked upward. Analysts lauded our culture of openness. Meanwhile, Whitman watched from the outside. He departed with a modest severance and a non-compete clause, meaning he couldn't work on anything related for a year. He tried to start a consultancy, but no one wanted to, as his old team now followed me. His LinkedIn posts about theoretical scaling methods went unanswered. His conference invites dwindled. Occasionally, I wondered if he'd realized the irony. The very tool he'd stolen from his lead engineer became the foundation of not only his downfall, but of a global movement I spearheaded. In late spring, our first Merino Protocol Summit filled the conference center in Silicon Valley. 3,000 developers, CTOs, students, and VCs packed the hall. I kicked off the opening session with a demo, a live cluster in South America automatically rerouting traffic via a university in Nairobi with zero manual intervention, proof positive of the protocol's self-healing prowess. Afterward, I wandered the expo floor, startup booths, Merino for retail, Merino in space, pitching integrations. I paused at a booth staffed by architecture students from MIT's Media Lab, showing an art installation that visualized network topology as living streams of color. They beamed as I approached. This is beautiful, I said. You see the code's heartbeat. They grinned. Thanks to Marino, we can prototype in real time. I realized then the true impact. Code I'd patented to force my former director's hand had blossomed into living art, educational tool, public good. Months after the summit, late one Friday, I worked in the Northern California office, sunlight fading behind oak trees outside the windows. A soft chime announced Joanna Reyes on Zoom. I answered. Marco, she began, breaking into a broad smile. The board just approved your next big project, a $50 million innovation fund to seed Marino protocol projects worldwide. And we're spinning up an in-house Marino lab. She paused. It's all you. I leaned back, the enormity sinking in. Thank you. This means everything. She laughed. Only two things matter here: real impact and the people who create it. You reminded us of that. We signed off, and I stared at the blank screen for a moment before shutting my laptop. I left the office under an aubergine sky, the trees rustling in dusk breeze, humming with possibility. That night, I sat on my porch with my fiancée, Tasha, sipping sparkling water. So, she said, hand on mine, you patented our future, sparked a revolution, and reopened your house of cards in the process. Ready for dinner? I smiled and slid her hand into mine. Absolutely, I'll cook. As we headed inside, I reflected on the journey, a director's dismissal that stung like an electric shock, a late-night patent application that fueled a quiet coup, an open-source revelation that set the world abuzz. I realized success isn't measured by titles or raises. It's measured by the legacy you build, the community you foster, and the doors you open for others. And as we stepped into the kitchen, I knew the next patent, the next protocol, the next innovation would be even sweeter, because it would come not from bitterness, but from a vision fierce enough to change the world.